Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Dan Powers, Executive Director of the Society for Science and User Research Facilities. We're starting another session as part of our 2022 annual meeting, and this is going to be regarding personal identifiers, and our speaker is going to be Shawna Sadler from Orchid. Before Shawna comes on the screen here, just let me give a little bit of framing as to what she's going to be talking about. We like to prompt this session with that question of how is your research being appropriately credited to your identity? Many people are likely familiar with Orchid, but Shawna is going to be describing Orchid and really the whole context of how persistent identifiers are a resource that our community should know about, and really what some of the latest technical capabilities there, and more so the legal and legislative priorities and protocols that have been instituted or are coming forward, born of both presidential directives here in the United States and other types of protocol designs and frameworks that are happening throughout actually the globe, and in Europe in particular as well. So Shawna, let's bring you onto the screen here. Shawna heads up the outreach and partnerships at Orchid, and she helps with building strategic relationships worldwide and exploring new opportunities for adoption of the Orchid platform and growth there. I've seen from the anecdotes of scientists who are using Orchid and the ability for that platform to ensure that there is as much of a firewall and a protection against plagiarism, against either intentional or unintentional overlap in terms of credibility, depending on what someone's name or the background of their research, where that's come from. And as the United States has been looking to ensure that there is protection and proper manifestation of people's research, having persistent identifiers that can be consistent and really provide that amount of credibility has become more and more important. And as I mentioned, is starting to become something that's required in a legislative sense. So Shawna, let me turn this to you, and you can describe exactly what people should know about persistent identifiers in Orchid.
Great. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen right now. I've put a few slides together just to help make sense of everything that I'm talking about here. So, great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate it. As Dan mentioned, persistent identifiers are becoming part of government policies, research funding policies, and including in a lot of new workflows as well. So I thought the SSURF community might like to have just a casual conversation about persistent identifiers. I'm going to give just a quick overview, and then we can open up to questions and have just maybe a bit more of a conversation, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of formalities coming out of governments and policies, and it's hard to understand it all. So we can just relax today and have a conversation, and hopefully to help make sense of it all. So I want to take a minute and just step back and provide some context for this topic. What we're really talking about is storage and access to knowledge. Before the digital era, research was submitted and disseminated on paper. Academic libraries collected that knowledge and made it available to researchers. Of course, a lot of researchers collect knowledge in their field and have their own personal libraries that they were always so proud of. But now we've transitioned to the digital era. Researchers are submitting their research in digital form, and most of this research is disseminated digitally as well. So some fields of study to continue to use the print form, and that's okay, and libraries still collect it and make it accessible. But in the sciences, which is most of the SSURF community, research really is disseminated digitally. And we're seeing policies, as you mentioned, in the US, the UK, that funders are really requiring that this scholarship is made available at the time of publication. There's not embargoes allowed anymore. So we're talking about the infrastructure that stores and makes research in digital form available. And to be honest, this transition from physical libraries being the container of knowledge, to we're talking about really the internet, and then people are accessing knowledge through the web. And to discover the research is used by search engines, whether those are public or scholarly search engines. And those search engines depend on really good metadata describing the research and, the researchers too. So this is an enormous infrastructure. And what's become clear about 15 years ago is that there's a lot of redundancy in the content, and it's hard to differentiate elements in the research ecosystem. So different vendors, mostly publishers, but vendors in general, started to use unique identifiers as a clear way to identify specific publications and researchers. But they quickly realized that it was hard, and it cut into their profit margins because it was a lot of work. And so these organizations came together and decided that this was really more of a governance body that was required. And so non-government, like nonprofit community-based organizations were created to maintain these identifiers and to ensure the metadata this rich metadata is available to be discovered. So as of today, there are 5 core persistent identifier providers in the research community. And then on the next slide, I'm going to provide a couple more that I think the SSURF community would like to know about. So in this wild infrastructure, this massive infrastructure that stores and disseminates research, some of the providers, you mentioned Orchid, which is where I'm from, which I work for. So I'm going to start with Orchid. As you mentioned, researchers, in the past, their names would be on papers, and that was sufficient. But today, gosh, the number of researchers, and some of those researchers have similar or the same name. And sometimes publishers format the name in a strange way. I know I've only been published 3 times, and my name is published in 3 different ways. So how do people know all 3 of those papers are me? Because I know there's 2 other Shawna Sadlers who publish as well. So who gets credit for that work? Dan, as you mentioned earlier. So the Orchid ID is really important. So I've given mine as an example here, and it ends in 5034. So the entity that Orchid provides these unique identifiers for are people. And so our sister organization, Crossref, provides unique identifiers for both publications, and I've provided an example, and also they've just started providing grant unique IDs as well. So when you publish, it's ideal that your publication get a unique ID, because that way when people search for it using one of the search engines, and hopefully there's rich metadata discovering it, they'll have a link to that publication that is persistent. So it doesn't, because we've all experienced the dead links, which is so frustrating. So these are persistent links that will always link you to that publication. And then it's the same with the grants that are being created now. So the grant, when at the time of award, will be issued an ID. Somebody can click on that link to get to a page that's on the web that will describe the metadata elements, of that grant. So the name of the grant, who was awarded to, possibly the amount, the provider of the grant, some of those core details. And then I thought I'd also make sure everyone in the SSURF community knew that DataCite is also one of the new important PID providers, persistent identifier providers as well. They provide the unique ID for digital objects of research. So most of the time those are data sets, but they can also be, videos of a performance or images, or any sort of digital object that is a form of research can have a DOI assigned to it. And then last, which is one of the newer but so critical, is the ROAR ID that's hosted at the California Digital Library. And they provide unique IDs to organizations. So there's actually some universities that have the same name. So there's the University of New England in Massachusetts in the US, and there's also a University of New England in Australia. So when you're a researcher applying and you say you're at that university, it's really important to know, are you at the American or the Australian version institution with that name? So the ROAR IDs have been incredibly helpful. And again, all of these organizations are nonprofit, community governed, global, unique persistent identifier providers. So I thought I would also mention for the group, there are 2 more the SSURF community might like to know about. So first is SciCrunch, that's based out of UC San Diego, and they provide unique persistent identifiers for research facilities and research instruments. And it's a really flexible structure that they provide. So if you're at a major organization that has multiple labs, each of your labs, so the organization would have a ROR ID, but then each lab could get its own ID through SciCrunch. And then within that lab, you can structure however you like your metadata structure to go, however you organize that lab. So there are possibly, several significant research instruments, and each of those instruments can get its own ID. And then the metadata describing that instrument is up to you. It can go down to the level of the make and model of that instrument if you'd like to keep track of that, if that's important to you. So SciCrunch is a great one to look into. The second one is RAID, and I really like their logo because it's genuinely an envelope is what their intent is. So they call it a research activity ID. I tend to think of it more as a research project ID. So say you have a research project with researchers from multiple organizations from around the world. You'll have your RAID ID, and then it can collect all the ORCID IDs of your researchers, and then you can have all the funding that's provided for that grant, for that project, and list all their grant IDs. And the same with, you could use the SciCrunch, will include all their tools that you're using for research instruments, and then all the ROR IDs for the organizations that are represented as part of that big research project. So you can tell by the URL, it ends in .au. It is provided by a federal government agency in Australia, and they are making it available globally. So that's a really exciting new persistent identifier I thought the community would like to hear about. So I thought, just in case, if people would like to get more involved in the persistent identifier community. So first, there's the Orchid Researcher Advisory Council. I'll just speak about Orchid. I won't speak to my sister organizations, but I thought this would be a good start. So Orchid, we do provide a Researcher Advisory Council. They advise Orchid, the board mostly, and also the staff. So Orchid, our goal is to be researcher focused. We always keep the researcher at the center of everything we do. And this council keeps us in check and makes sure that we really are acting in the best interests of researchers. And so I listed these bullet points. I won't go through them now, but really it's to keep, to make sure that we're on the right track and we're delivering the services that researchers need around the world. And so we do have researchers from all disciplines and that represent countries from around the world. The call for nominations is usually at the end of the year, Q3, Q4 of any year. So keep an eye out for that if that interests you. And then if you're an administrator in a research organization, and if your organization is a member of Orchid, you can apply to be on Orchid's board. You can self-nominate or have somebody nominate you. And so this is more to oversee the governance of Orchid and to help us with the administrative priorities and how we should be moving forward to meet the stakeholder requirements of our community, really. So again, we usually call for nominations closer to the end of the year, Q3, Q4 of any year. And then I'm going to end there. So hopefully that was a good start to kick off some questions from our audience.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shawna. I wanted to ask particularly if there was a realm of research or academia where you're seeing more inquiries or more newer clients coming in to set up their profiles, and in some ways where there might be some growth in realms of science that would be of interest for any of our network to understand that this is where there's a lot of activity. Sure.
So the early days of Orchid, we saw the early uptake really came in more of the traditional sciences, physics, particularly computer science. They understood the importance of persistent identifiers, and they structured their data and their research findings really well, and they adopted those. And so we've been working with those communities, and the adoption is really high in those communities. Medicine came in very quickly soon after, and chemistry as well has had a tremendous adoption. The American ACS adopted Orchid, and they're really strongly using our infrastructure and because they are one of the examples of a great container of knowledge for containing that knowledge and disseminating it really well. And so they're a strong adopter of Orchid and all the persistent identifiers. So where we're starting to see kind of more uptake is in industry is starting to show interest, that they do recognize they want to participate in R&D. And so we're starting to get more interest, from the pharmaceutical industry, other R&D as well, who want to be part of the conversation and to make sure they're contributing. And it's a little bit slower on the humanities and the social sciences, but we're really excited to work with those communities. And as they're developing their infrastructures and they're transitioning from print to digital, we're really excited to be part of those infrastructure developments. And they can probably skip over some of the early hurdles that, the sciences kind of experience as we're, learning how to build this research infrastructure. So, but it's going really well. And then globally as well. So we do a lot of work in the US, the UK, Australia. A lot of those G7 countries have a really strong ORCID presence, and I'm transitioning. We're doing a lot of work in India right now, and we have a lot of interest in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So, and actually, we're really excited. Ukraine, even through their difficulties of the last, 2 years, they did form an ORCID consortium and really supported their researchers and to keep their research going. And ORCID, we supported that. We helped them out there too.
Right. Could you describe what's been going on in the United States, the federal level, with some newer protocols that are going to be required upon researchers or research organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been the last couple of years, we've seen two specific memos that related to persistent identifiers. So the first one came as a result of research security and making sure that any researchers who are funded by US public funds are not exploited by foreign interference, and just really protecting the researchers. And so some of the new requirements around the disclosure that researchers have to disclose their affiliations really in their research profile. And so unfortunately, that's going to be an increase in administrative burden on researchers, which was the last thing they wanted to hear. But in the memo, there is direction to the funders to adopt persistent identifiers to help reduce that administrative burden. And so the OSTP, the White House, gave direction to the funders to streamline their workflows and to adopt persistent identifiers. So that way the machines are connected and the machine readable URLs can pass the data between systems. And so when a researcher opens the form to fill out, their bio sketch or the current pending support form, we understand there's going to be an ORCID button right at the top. And so when they log in, they share their ORCID ID with that form, it'll pre-populate with the data that's in their ORCID record. And so that way researchers will only have to edit the form. They won't have to enter in all their data, which they've been doing for far too long and far too often. So hopefully, so we're expecting to see those forms in January. Now, I should mention, there's a catch. This only applies to researchers who are applying for funding, who are external to a government agency. And so, we understand that'll be mostly university researchers, but intramural researchers or contract researchers will be for the most part, we understand they'll be given a pass on that. But there'll still be some sort of disclosure activity happening, but hopefully we can be supportive there. The second memo that just came out recently, I think in August, is the Nelson memo, as it's commonly known, and that's really about public access. And I quickly mentioned it, but really it's publicly funded research should be made available publicly, and that publishers are not allowed to embargo anymore. And it's not just the US that came out of the UK about a year or two ago. UKRI requires public access upon the time of publication as well. And, we're seeing it from other funders around the world. So with ORCID, we're just part of that bigger infrastructure. And there's that Nelson memo also, it's lower down in the memo, it's section 4. They do talk about the requirement to include persistent identifiers in the research infrastructure that does store the research and then make it publicly available. So that way the links and the metadata are reliable for the public who want to access the research, and they can find the research. And then really another part of this is trust in research and researchers. That we've gone through a bit of a tough time. It's been a turbulent time. The COVID research about COVID was made publicly available, we were able to respond and get the vaccines quickly, and we're able to hopefully minimize the impact of the pandemic, although it was still significant. But open research really made the case for making research available. And so hopefully that we've made the case for open research, but unfortunately there was all the really difficult times about trust in research. And so one of the things about, including the persistent identifiers in the research is if someone from the public sees an article, they can look at the list of researchers, they can click on the ORCID ID of each researcher to see their profile, and that will help the public understand the level of trust that they want to put into this paper that they're reading. If there's no ORCID ID on the paper, then as a reader, it's hard to know the level of trust to put into that. But if you can see the ORCID ID in the profile and that person has extensive research experience and they have, employment as a professional researcher, it does enhance that trust.
All right. Thank you. And it does seem like it gets into some real nuances or complexities there on what researchers have to be aware of, or what they both in terms of concerns for them to address, but also these other protocols that are coming online.
That's true.
Very interesting then.
You mentioned one other thing earlier, and that's the third topic that is starting to rise, which is really unfortunate, but it's the fraudulent use of researchers' name to give credibility to really for the most part, machine generated research, which has really been disruptive to the research community. And there was you mean
like artificial intelligence?
Well, no, more like just fraudulent research that they're almost like, I think of them as pirates, really. They're developing these garbage papers. There's no scientific method. They're just publishing for the sake of, trying to get hits. And it's been a really disruptive experience in the publishing world. And so it's multifaceted, but unfortunately, some of these fraudulent papers are using real researchers' names, either as authors or peer reviewers without the knowledge of the researcher, and being published, and it's not being checked. And so this is becoming a real issue. And there was a congressional hearing in this about 6-7 months ago. And so one of the witnesses said, part of the solution could be Orchid to help validate and verify that this author was actually an author on this paper. And when there's an ORCID ID on the paper, it again gives that trust to the reader that this author really did write this article. So
right.
So it's really a Wild West time. This transition from print to digital we're still in transition, and we're still building this infrastructure so that it's robust and secure. And so it's a time of change, but it's also exciting to be part of this new initiative. So I'll try to spin it in a positive way.
Yeah, well, it's a resource that Orchid provides that is just part of the landscape of research in the 21st century here. And thank you very much for giving us this background. And how can people reach you? It's a relatively short URL for your website.
Yes, orchid.org. So ORCID.org.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Shawna. And your information, I hope, has prompted some people to check out the latest with Orchid. And if you're already a robust Orchid user, we're glad to know that you're taking advantage of that resource. Thanks again, Shawna. Thanks, everyone, for tuning into this session. We'll be starting another session in just a few minutes.